and the mic is all yours. And we thank you very, very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Can I just get a thumbs up if everybody can hear me? Everybody, at least on Zoom, I can see. I know there's like 4 different YouTube lives going from all the different islands and places. So those you I can't see on YouTube, my friends on YouTube, but at least on Zoom, thank you. Okay, so it sounds good. Nice to meet you all. Nice to see you all. I once heard a story about this older Jewish fellow. Calls his wife over, says, "Honey, please come sit on the bed beside me." And then she says, okay, it's a little strange request. She sits down beside him. He says, "Honey, remember when we were in our 20s and I broke my leg and you were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." "And remember when I was in my 40s and I went bankrupt and you were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." "And remember in my 50s when I had my heart attack? You were there with me?" "Yes, honey, I was." So he leans in, he says, "Honey, I have something to tell you." So a tear rolls down her cheek. She says, "Yes." He says, "Honey, you're bad luck." So there are some subjects that are just bad luck. They seem taboo. We don't want to talk about them. We don't want to hear about them. Certainly burial, cremation, death, afterlife. It's just, I don't want to hear about it. A comedian once said, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying." It's just one of those subjects that we just don't want to deal with. And by the way, I understand. I mean, we're not supposed to be too focused on death. What do Jews say when we have a drink? L'chaim, right? It's all about life. Some of you may remember that in 1995, when Israeli Prime Minister Yigal Rabin was shot, was assassinated, then President Bill Clinton gave a eulogy, a beautiful eulogy for him. The last couple of words of that eulogy became a bumper sticker in Israel. Shalom Chaver, goodbye my friend, you may remember. It became sort of a slogan around the world. And but he also said something very interesting, Bill Clinton at the time. He said that in the Jewish prayer for the dead, by the way, there is no Jewish prayer for the dead. What do you think he was referring to? Kaddish, right? In the Kaddish prayer, there's no actual reference to death. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shmei rabbah. May his name be elevated and sanctified. Even in our own tradition, we don't over-focus on death. There were some societies historically that it seemed that they were very death-focused. We don't know for sure. Archaeology is a tricky thing, but from the sound of it, ancient Egypt, ancient Tibet, they had a book of the dead. From what we understand, their societies were very death-focused. In the modern world, not at all. People are uncomfortable with it. We don't want to talk about it, I want to think about it. And even in the Jewish world, it's not a major topic, but that has a drawback. Yes, we're supposed to focus on life. Yes, we're not supposed to be too concerned about what happens after. Agreed. But when you're making decisions without information, important decisions, then you have to have a little more information to talk about it a little bit more. The Talmud doesn't have a huge section on burial, but it does have a section on burial. The Code of Jewish Law does not have a huge section on burial, but it has a section. And sometimes we've forgotten that. So that's what I'm trying to do now, is to just get some information. There's been a massive sea change in Jewish life, part of the life cycle, I guess. Looking around the screen, at least people I can see on Zoom, many of us are the same generation. When we were kids, cremation rates amongst the Jewish community were low single digits, less than 5% when we were kids. Today, I know you're all in the 4 different communities all over, but let's just focus on the stats that we know. We know American stats. Today, do you know what percentage of the US, let's forget about Jews for a second, just overall, all right, Christians, Jews, whatever, in the US, what's the overall cremation rate today? Anybody know? What I love about Zoom is that it has a great chat function, which means that you can speak. We can't have the mute off for the whole talk. It's just too hard to hear. But we'll do that for questions and answers. I'm going to share some ideas, and we'll have questions and answers. But for now, I'll use the chat function, and you tell me, what do you think is the cremation rate today? Are people able to? Probably people able to chat? No, doesn't look like the chat is on. Okay, anybody have any ideas? You can turn off your mute or just tell me. Yeah?
No, the chat is on. The chat is
Should
on.
be zero, shouldn't it?
Look, what it should be and what it is are different, quite different questions. So I'll give you the national statistic, right? The national statistic is that overall in 2017, the majority of the American dead were cremated. It flipped in 2017. For our entire lives, it was always a small minority going up steadily. Now it's about 53% of the American dead are cremated. That's a national stat of all people, 340 million Americans. There's roughly a 1%, just under a 1% death rate in Western countries. Last year, unfortunately, it was, it was a little bit higher because of COVID, about 3 million deaths. Over half of them are cremations. Now for Jews, it's not quite that high, but it's not as low as people think. So we don't know for sure, but here is the main stat that we do know. About 10 years ago, okay, the chat seems to be working, everybody. So there you go. Thank you very much, Rabbi. So we'll be able to use it. So anybody know what's the Jewish number? What percentage of the Jewish dead today, 2021, what is your guess? About half of Americans are being cremated, but amongst Jews, what do you think it is? When you and I were kids, it was less than 5%. Now, well, as you think about it, I'll give you one source that we do have. About 10 years ago, Rabbi Elchanan Zom, who's the head of the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society in New York, he's sort of the rabbi's rabbi on these matters, he did an informal survey of Jewish funeral homes in the New York area. And he found that in Jewish funeral homes in the New York area, 25% of the requests were for cremation. By the way, anybody get those caveats? That's for people who live in New York, very highly Jewish community compared to much of the rest of the country. That's for people who chose Jewish funeral homes, meaning they're affiliated enough that they care to do Jewish funeral home rather than no funeral home. And that's 10 years ago. Today, there's no doubt that 1/3 of the Jewish dead in America are being cremated. In parts of the country, it is probably far higher. So my question for you is, what has changed? Forget about Jews for a second. Let's just talk about the North American trend. Use the chat function. Tell me what you think. Why are people today in the West cremating more than when we were kids, more than ever before? So I see that Mr. Ainsley, you're saying our percentage is 0%. With all due respect, your reputation precedes you as a historian, a tour guide. I also am one, but that's not true. That is only for perhaps affiliated Jews that you know about. The reason I know it's not true is because there's no country on planet Earth that the Jewish rate of cremation is 0, not even in Israel. It is simply a statistical impossibility. Maybe the people who are connected to the community have a 0 cremation rate. That's not, by the way, what I hear from these rabbis, but there certainly is cremation. It exists everywhere. But I'm glad to hear, Mr. Ainsley, that it's low. What do you think are the reasons? Let's focus. Let's get a little deeper now. What do you think are the reasons? So cost. Very good. So I see you're saying cost. It's easier. Some say it's easier. Excellent. You guys are getting some of the top reasons. Movement of people. Wow. Mobility. Chabad of the Caribbean. Your people are amazing. All the top answers are coming through. Care for the environment. That's unbelievable. Okay. What we're going to do, ladies and gentlemen, we have a short amount of time and I want to use our time well. We're going to divide our time together into 3. First, I want to analyze the reasons you have given why people are choosing cremation. We're going to find out together that many of those reasons are not true, right? Some of them are, but many are not true. We're going to analyze them one by one. We're then going to flip the script and we're going to try and understand why Jews throughout history have focused so much on burial. And then we're going to open up to questions and comments. Everybody get the 3 sections? Talk about cremation, then talk about burial, then questions and comments. Okay, let's go through your reasons. By the way, you gave the answers that I hear everywhere. I speak about a lot of different subjects. I've written a number of books. One's called Raising Kids to Love Being Jewish. One's Why Be Jewish. Written books on Israel, all different things. And but this is the #1 request that I get from communities to speak about. So I speak about it probably about once a week, if not twice a week, to communities all over the world. And you have very quickly, actually, you have gotten the top answers. Okay. So I see there's some questions. I can't answer questions now, but we'll get there at the end in the third section. Okay, environment. Everybody mentions the environment. There's two main environmental critiques of burial. One is the amount of land that is used, and two is what goes into the land. They're two separate but connected points. The argument on the amount of land is that land is for the living. You've heard this idea that, put it this way, it's a moral argument. We have a limited amount of land. We have a growing Jewish population. Never mind Jewish, let's talk about Americans. We have a growing population, so we're running out of land. So why waste land on dead bodies that don't need it? It's a very moral argument, right? Because you and I both know that if you had to make a choice between the living and the dead, you choose the living. What's the problem with the argument? I've run the numbers. I'm not the only one who's run the numbers, but my book on the subject, the little plug, Cremation or Burial, A Jewish View, it came out in 2012. I've spoken to many thousands of people since then. I've never once been challenged on these numbers. I believe they are inarguable, okay? Get this stat, talking about the United States. If every American who died, that's about 3 million a year, were to be buried, it would take, get this, 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's land mass. Isn't that an amazing stat? 10,000 years, and we all know that very few cemeteries, if any, would survive 10,000 years to use up 1% of America's land mass. By the way, that is not just true in Wyoming and North Dakota, in every state of the Union. There is plenty of land. This is true in North America, in South America, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in Australia. It is true in almost every place in the world. By the way, I haven't studied your 4 communities, but I will tell you that even in communities like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan, very highly dense, there's no problem of land. This is really not an issue. And serious environmentalists do not talk about this issue because it's not a real issue. We use far more land every year to build new Walmarts than we do for cemeteries, right? The real environmental issue is what goes into the land. 2 main environmental critiques of burial. And by the way, boy, are these strong critiques. There's 2 things that get put into land in modern burials that are horrible. Number 1, metal caskets. The amount of energy required to make the metal, then it goes into the land and it rusts for 1,000 years. Horrible for Mother Earth. I'm a big environmentalist, okay? It's terrible, right? Number 2, embalming. Embalming, if you aren't aware, forgive me for getting into the gross stuff, but it is a talk on burial and cremation, so I'm sure you expected something. It's when they remove the blood and other liquids, basically the blood from a body, and replace it with preservatives. Formaldehyde is still the #1 choice today, right? In order to have the body still decomposes, it just takes a little longer, right? It's nicer for the viewing, it lasts a few months, it's whatever. So gallons and gallons of toxic chemicals being put straight into the earth millions of times a year. It's horrible for planet Earth. 2 verifiable, real environmental disasters with modern burial. Now, ladies and gentlemen, rabbis, you are not allowed to answer this question. Ladies and gentlemen, what do these 2 things have in common? Metal caskets and embalming. I see people smiling. What they have in common is that we don't do either. They are both completely against Jewish law and Jewish tradition. We require simple wood caskets, really any wood, ideally simple wood. By the way, in Israel, we don't even use caskets. The body is brought to the grave in a wood casket, but then the body is taken out and put into the ground in shrouds alone. The caskets are actually reused, right? We don't even need caskets. Sometimes municipal laws require caskets, so that's the custom in different countries. But the simple wood is what is required in Judaism. No metal, and embalming, definitely not considered a desecration of the body. By the way, if you would like to understand why we do not embalm, right, then just go on YouTube and watch an embalming. You'll understand in about 10 seconds why we don't do it. It's a horrible desecration of the body. It's terrible. So environmentally, it's funny. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. It's just a misconception. Cremation uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. We're all getting rid of our gas-guzzling cars and getting Teslas, right? Cremation uses a tremendous amount of fossil fuels. I got stats, like when I was researching this, I got the blueprints of a tremendous amount of electricity to burn, and it releases toxic chemicals into the air. If you're my age or older, and if you have a filling in your teeth, you probably have mercury in your tooth. Now, younger people, like fillings now, they don't put in mercury, but in our day they did. Releases terrible mercury into the air. Many municipalities do not allow crematory ovens beside schools. Ask yourself why. By the way, about 6 months ago, the Los Angeles Times, I think is the main thing, had this article. It was on the news programs as well. You can Google it. That the city of Los Angeles relaxed its pollution rules because of the COVID crisis. The crematorium were working extra, releasing extra pollution into the air, breaking the rules, and the city had to cancel the air pollution maximums, right, to allow them to do more cremations because there are more people dying. Get the point? Cremation pollutes. That's the point. Environmentalists are not in favor of cremation. Cremation is bad for the environment. They're in favor of what's called green burial. Green burial's main components: no embalming, no metal caskets, obviously cemetery design, some are better, some are worse, but like those are by far, Jewish burial is environmentally friendly, has always been a model of environmentalism. Okay, next thing that you mentioned, and we're moving quickly, we'll have time and questions and comments to get more into anything that you want. You mentioned mobility, families move. It was in the old country, so to speak. It was pretty simply a family plot. Somebody mentioned that they're in Montreal, so I'm from Montreal, and in Montreal we have we have 4 generations of graves right beside each other. It's kind of nice, actually. Kind of live together. But today, that's not modern life. I mean, the grandparents are in one city, the kids are in another city, the grandkids are in another city. People move around like we used to change shirts. So where am I going to be buried? Florida has a very high cremation rate. Many reasons for it. One of them is the number of retirees. So people say that, listen, I'm going to be buried here in Florida. Everybody I know is dead or dying, retirement village. Nobody's going to visit my grave. Back in New York, I haven't lived there in 20 years. Out in California, where the kids are, I mean, the grandkids aren't going to stay there. So what's the point of having a grave if nobody's going to visit it? Might as well just be cremated. You hear the point? It's very interesting, isn't it? So now I want to test your Jewish knowledge. Rabbis, we're not allowed to answer this question, but you better know the answer. Okay, in the Bible, there are 2 famous burials. There's tons of burials in the Bible. It's actually a lot, but there's 2 very famous ones. One's at the beginning of the Bible, where Abraham buries Sarah in Hebron. Rachel also, you're right, 3 great ones in Bethlehem. But at the end of the Bible, the end of the Torah, there is a very famous burial. God buries Moses. Now, true or false, right? Thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false. The number 1 tourist destination in Israel. I see Mr. Ainsley smiling when I mention tourism and history and stuff. So the number 1 tourist destination in Israel is the grave of Moses. Thumbs up or thumbs down? True or false? I see people are answering very good. So first of all, on a technical score, he's not buried in Israel. Remember at the end of the Bible, he doesn't make it into the land of Israel. We can just hop on a plane in normal times. At least you can just hop on a plane and go. But he's buried in what's now the kingdom of Jordan. Right, and he doesn't make it in. He goes up the mountain. He's seen the promised land. Right, Martin Luther King Jr. uses that imagery for his famous speech. But more importantly, We don't know where he's buried. God hid the place of his burial. The main explanation is simply that he was so holy that it could have become a place of idol worship. And rather than have people worship him as a god, God hid the place of burial and says clearly no one has ever visited the grave of Moses in 3,000 years, ever. So now, ask yourself a question, right? Why did God choose burial? Archaeologically, 3,000 years ago, cremation was the norm. Verifiable proof. That was the norm in the world 3,000 years ago. And yet God didn't choose cremation. He chose burial. Because in our modern minds, we connect two ideas. And it's a reasonable connection. The two ideas that we connect are visiting a grave and having a grave. And we think if no one's going to visit the grave, then why do you have to bother having one? And since the kids are far away, or the kids are not that traditional, or the kids don't care, or I don't have kids, then why bother having a grave? The lesson of Moses, the greatest of all prophets, right? The book of Moses, is that visiting a grave is nice. I actually get a kick out of it in a strange kind of way. I'm not a weirdo. I don't go every day, but I actually connect to visiting graves. You know, it's part of my. I'm a tour guide in Poland and in Eastern Europe and in Israel as well. And it means something. When I go home, I always visit the graves. It means something to me. You can or you can't. It's a personal thing. There's no obligation to go, but it's irrelevant in terms of the question of having a grave. Meaning, even if no one visits the grave, it is important to have one, as we will learn why. By the way, it's funny how there's very, very often a kid, a grandkid who gets into Jewish genealogy or gets a little more traditional, and having the grave means something, surprisingly. In every family, there's always one. But even without that, having a grave is important, as we will learn. Other reasons, I'm moving quickly just because I want to make sure that we cover the main ideas. Somebody mentioned the convenience. It's easier, right? So like this, when I started research, I spent about 3 years researching the subject, and the single biggest surprise, going back to 2010, 2011, and the biggest surprise that I had in my research, before that I didn't know anything about burial and cremation really, and the biggest surprise that I had was that I always thought that cremation was something like a microwave oven. You put the body in, you press the button, 5 minutes later, ashes come out, maybe in an urn, and taken care of, quick and easy, right? Well, ladies and gentlemen, forgive me for what I'm about to share with you. Okay, it has to be said. Cremation is neither quick nor easy. For a thin person, it takes 60 to 90 minutes. If, like me, COVID-19 has done a number on you. They call it the COVID-19, put on 19 pounds. But if you're overweight like me and I think it's like 3/4 of North America, then it's 2 to 3 hours. If your BMI is above 30, right? I'm heading there, unfortunately. I hope things change. COVID's not been good. Then it's 3 to 4 hours. During that time, forgive me, the body is neither still nor calm. The muscles are contracting and expanding. The brain is sizzling. It's disgusting. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that burial is pleasant. I remember high school labs, chemistry, okay? I've seen things decompose. They're both kind of gross, okay? They're both kind of gross. But here's the kicker. Burial is the natural way of every living thing. A plant grows, blossoms, goes back to Mother Earth. An animal is born, runs around the forest, goes back to Mother Earth. Cremation is man-made, artificial. Burial is natural. Isn't that like flip the script? It's amazing. That's not how the way it's portrayed, right? Cremation's $1 billion industry. There's two big conglomerates that run it all, right? They present themselves as nature. Furthermore, it's not that quick and easy. Why? I'll say it like this. I deal a lot with families on the subject. I have never met a family where choosing burial harms the family dynamic. I have rarely met a family that chooses cremation that doesn't harm the family dynamic. There's always someone at some point that is hurt by it. There's no closure. It doesn't, I recently lost my father and I went through the whole Shiva process. For those of you who have, you understand the wisdom of the Jewish tradition of coming full circle, earth to earth, ashes to ashes. It may be quicker physically, but it's not quick and it's not easy. There's a fellow in Michigan who, his name is Thomas Lynch, and he's a great combination of jobs. He's a prize-winning poet and an undertaker. He's a funeral home. And he said the following. He said, people think that, well, I don't want to be a burden on my kids, which is whoever wrote the idea of being, easy, right? Cremation seems easier. Just like, don't worry about a burial, don't worry about a grave, don't worry. Some people, they don't feel that they did enough honor, for their parents and visit their parents' graves. They don't want to put a grave and do that to their kids, but it's all kinds of things that we have in our heads. So Thomas Lynch said something fascinating, in my opinion. He said, we don't want to be a burden to our kids, but if taking care of us at the end of life and after life, if we can't do that for our parents, then what burden can we handle? Is that not the greatest final responsibility of a child, of a grandchild? It's an amazing way of looking at things. My point is, ladies and gentlemen, when you go through the reasons that people choose cremation today, I think we did all your main ones. We can go back, questions in the answer period soon, and that we'll deal with anything else that you want to. But when you go through the reasons that people choose cremation, they're almost always based on misinformation. It is not better for the environment. It is not quick and easy. It does not solve mobility problems. Again, there's only one reason for cremation that when you get down to it is actually true. There's one reason for cremation. I am very straight and honest, full disclosure. There is one reason for cremation that is an undeniable advantage. What is it? Ladies and gents, what's the one thing that is undeniable that no rabbi can argue? Exactly right. In 9 cases out of 10, cremations are cheaper than burials. Sometimes the difference is insignificant. You can have expensive cremations and you can have cheap burials. COVID has shown us you can do burials at a funeral home, just graveside. But in most cases, 9 cases out of 10, the average cremation will end up costing, when you add everything up, the average cremation will end up costing $3,000-$4,000, and the average burial will be something like 8 to 10. In the Caribbean, you tell me, I don't know, but that's the national numbers, those are European numbers. It's something in that realm. There's usually a $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 difference at the end of the day. So my question is, so why is it worth the extra money? Guys, when you proposed to your beloved and you gave her a ring, I assume you did not get the ring out of a Cracker Jack box, right? You paid a little extra for that ring. There are some things in life that are worth the extra money. I'd like to share a few minutes now explaining why, in my opinion, why Jews have always said that this is worth the extra money. By the way, when you pre-plan it and you prepay it out over a number of years, the difference is insignificant, right? It's a Starbucks coffee every week. But, if you leave it to the end, then it's an extra, cost down. Here, there's a difference of a few $1,000s. So why is it worth the extra bucks? And I'm going to share a few headlines, and then we'll get into questions and comments, and you'll be able to ask anything you want to get more details on anything you want. Number one, in World War II, in the Kovno ghetto, there was a rabbi. His name was Rav Ephraim Oshry. He survived the war, actually, and he told the following story. One day, he's in his little room in the ghetto, and a Nazi SS officer barges in. He thinks he's about to die, and the Nazi officer starts speaking to him in perfect Yiddish. Rabbi, I'm a Jew. I have fake papers. I looked the part. This is how I'm surviving. But I have an important question for you. I'm a very sick man. I don't have long to live. And I know what they're going to do to me when I die. They're going to bury me in a Nazi cemetery surrounded by Nazis with a Nazi cross over me forever. For a few months to survive, I could fake it like this, but for eternity, I can't be there. I can't do it. Rabbi, can I be cremated to avoid the fate of being buried in a Nazi cemetery with a Nazi cross over my body forever? And Rabbi Oshri took the man's hand and said, my dear, dear child, no, you can't. A Jew must do whatever he or she can to be buried. In normal times, that means full Jewish burial. That means the Hevra Kadisha, the burial society, but it's actually called the Holy Society, right? Hevra Kadisha, only group in Jewish history, as far as I know, that's called the Holy Society. They take the body, they prepare the body. The body is, the proper Jewish prayers are said. A little bit of dirt, land, of earth from the land of Israel is put in, right? It says those Jewish letters on the grave, right? In proper times, you do everything right. In normal times, in our terrible times, what we call the Holocaust, the least you must do is to have burial. And even if it means being buried in a Nazi cemetery, it's better than choosing cremation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not guilt. Interestingly, Judaism is not into guilt. I know that surprises us all because we always talk about Jewish guilt, but we're about the future. If you chose cremation for your relatives, for your loved ones, and they were cremated, I'm not trying to beat you up, and don't beat yourself up. Okay, we look forward, not past. Okay, make a donation to Chabad of the Caribbean. They didn't ask me to say that, but they deserve it. And and move on, right? But we're trying to understand the reality. And the first reason that Jews have focused on burial for 3,000 years, if there's a Jewish community, a new Jewish community, you know what the first three things are a new Jewish community should do? A Jewish school, a ritual bath, a mikveh, and Jewish burial. Top three things a Jewish community is supposed to take care of. Anybody here recognize the name Gilad Shalit? I see people nodding, right? He was that poor Israeli soldier. He was kidnapped by Hamas, not this time, the last time, and 5 years in a Hamas prison. And we in Israel exchanged 2,000 terrorists to get him out. By the way, I think he just got married or something. It's like good news. There's like, he's doing okay. We're all very happy for him and his family, obviously. Very controversial decision, by the way, in Israel. Right? Many of those terrorists have already been rearrested for doing other acts of terror, right? But it's a famous story that we did that. What is a little bit less famous, but at least in Israel is well known, is that several times in Israeli history, we have traded hundreds of living terrorists in order to get back dead bodies and give them proper Jewish burial. Several times we've done it for hundreds of terrorists. By the way, you can be for or against that decision. It's not so simple. But the fact is, we do it. Jewish burial is a core part of being Jewish, a core part of Judaism. We don't think that. We think it's like, bagels and lox, like do what you want. It's like a minor, cute Jewish thing. No. This is all over the Bible. Rabbi Oshri, when he spoke to this fake Nazi, he quoted biblical verses. For those who want to look, one of the main texts, not the only text, the main text is Deuteronomy 21:22. It's when somebody's actually put to death, which is very rare in Judaism, right? Like it says, Talmud says that if a court puts someone to death once in 70 years, it's too much, right? It's basically the deterrent level. Death penalty is basically deterrent. So even if it actually happens and the evil guy is strung up on a pole, you got to bring him down and bury him. That's how, all the more so for the rest of us. It's all through the Talmud, it's in the Maimonides, in the Code of Jewish Law. This is serious. If I was creating a religion, I don't think I would really care, what happens to dead bodies. But our religion does. Our tradition does. This is fundamental. It's not just bagels and lox. That's the number one reason why Jews focus on burial. It's actually a core part of Judaism. Number two, if you were to make a map of the world in terms of belief, meaning you have belief in one God versus atheism, belief in no gods, or polytheism, belief in many gods, and you were to make another map of burial versus cremation, you'd find incredible overlap. Think about it. There's exceptions to every rule, I know, but think about it. In places where there is not a strong current of monotheism, whether it is post-Christian Europe, right? 70% cremation rates. Whether it is polytheistic, the East, right? Hinduism, Japan or India, 95% cremation rates. Even in America, by the way, where the Bible Belt has much lower cremation rates than the quote unquote secular coasts, right? Islam, the Islamic countries in the Middle East, there's no cremation. By the way, there is no cremation. Not a crematorium in Islamic countries. Doesn't exist. In Israel, there's only one. It's on a moshav not far from Haifa, and it is basically used for Russian non-Jews. Although some Jews are using it, but we're talking 1%, 2%. It's almost nothing. Why is that? Why is it that when you find, by the way, Europe, post-Christian Europe, very high, but when Europe was Christian, there was no cremation. Charlemagne, it was outlawed for 1,500 years in Catholic Europe. There's no cremation. It's funny, when you find belief in one God, you generally find high burial rates and low cremation rates. There's a lot of literature as to why, because we're short in time. I'll share with you my theory. My theory is that people know this idea from the beginning of the Bible, beginning of the Torah, that every human being is created in the image of God, right? The Tselem Elohim, the image of God. Now, God is not physical, but we're physical. There's some kind of image of God, whatever that means. And you don't mess with that image. When you were a kid and your beloved pet dog, Spot, died, I can virtually guarantee that your parents didn't say, okay, honey, you bring over Spot's body, I'll fire up the barbecue. Like, they didn't say that, right? You didn't burn Spot. What did you do to Spot? You buried Spot. Because get this, we bury things we love. We bury treasure. What do we do to the garbage? You burn the garbage, whatever. You bury treasure, you burn the garbage. Isn't that fascinating? Anybody remember Katrina, when it hit Hurricane Katrina? I don't know if it hit you in the Caribbean. Forgive my ignorance. I don't know if it did. It probably did. But when in Louisiana, there were all the shuls that were flooded in, and there were all these Torah scrolls that were destroyed. Anybody remember what happened to the Torah scrolls? That actually had beautiful ceremonies, and they buried them. If a Torah scroll gets damaged, we take it to the rabbi, take it to the scribe, and it gets fixed. Right? If it can't be fixed, you bury it, because we bury holy objects. We bury treasure. By the way, what's holier, a Torah scroll or you? I'll prove it to you. If God forbid there's a fire in shul. Don't worry, Rabbi, it's just a hypothetical. God forbid it should happen. Let's say there's a fire in the synagogue. Do you risk your life to save the Torah scrolls? Absolutely not. If you can save the Torah scrolls, if the firemen say, yeah, you can go, it's just a little smoke damage, get them out of there, but you can go in safely, then big mitzvah, go, save the Torah scrolls, of course. But if there is any risk to you, you don't. Because it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're old or you're young, if you're male or you're female, if you're very observant or not observant at all. You are holier than a Torah scroll. And we bury Torah scrolls because of their holiness. All the more so we bury a human being. Ever go to a Jewish funeral and the mourners, the close relatives, do something called tearing kriya? God forbid you lose somebody, they tear the outer garment. Anybody seen that custom? Age-old custom. Sometimes they give like a ribbon or a tie or something to cut. It's a nice idea. The actual custom is the age-old custom is actually your outer garment to show loss. Life doesn't go on, right? It's not okay. You're supposed to feel it. Imagine this. Mother Earth herself, the planet, tears kriya. A hole is opened up in the fabric of the earth. A grave is dug. It looks off. It is off. It's not okay. There's something wrong here. The pain is real. And slowly, lovingly, the body is placed back into Mother Earth. Relatives, friends, community, pour the dirt on top. Healing begins. But there is always a gravestone. The person is never forgotten. The world is different because of them. The world itself tears kriya. That's what burial is. One more idea, and then maybe two quick ideas, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. Something that I haven't actually talked a lot about, but in a sense is the most important thing, and if you want more information on it, we'll talk later, is the soul. When you get down to it, that's like the most important part of us, right? So let me address it. I wanted to talk practically and to address all the ideas that people have heard before, but let's spend at least a few minutes like this. Raise your hand if you have ever visited a Jewish monastery or a Jewish convent. Anyone? Trick question, guys. I know you haven't. Why? Because there aren't any. Why is that? What, you think Catholics are stupid? They're not stupid. You think the Eastern mystics with their monasteries and their nuns, Buddhist nuns, you think they're stupid? They're not stupid. So why do billions of people, their religions, have convents and monasteries, and we don't? It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Ask a Catholic, who's the holiest person on planet Earth. They'll probably say the Pope, completely celibate. Eastern mystics, right? Stay away from physicality. Celibate, sleep on stone floors, eat simple food. Why is that? Well, they're not stupid. It's just a different philosophy. Their philosophy is, if you want to be spiritual, you want to reach up, then you have to deny the physical, fight the physical. The physical is bad, right? Only get married and have an intimate life to avoid sin. Otherwise, it's a bad thing. If you're really special spiritual, become a priest, become a nun. Stay away from that. But physicality is bad. The world is a world of suffering. What is the Jewish view? They're two very different religions, but they share this one idea. It's fascinating. What is the Jewish view of physicality? The Jewish view of physicality is the exact opposite. God is a good God that created a good world, and our bodies are good. The soul and the body are not enemies. They are partners. I couldn't give charity tzedakah without my hand. I couldn't cheer up somebody who's lonely without my arms to give them a hug. Physicality is good. That's why Jewish festivals have food. And that's why you're supposed to have a beautiful, intimate life with your spouse. The physical world is good. God is good. He created a good world. So do you hear the logic? If you think the body is bad, no surprise that you're going to burn it. But if you think the body is good, if you know the body is good, that the body and the soul are partners, then you treat it with respect. And the soul and the body don't really separate fully after death. Imagine this. Imagine a woman who comes back from burying her husband, married for 50 years. He dies, she buries him, comes back, takes off the black dress, puts on a red party dress, and that very night goes out clubbing looking for a new guy. Seem normal to you? Of course not. When you have a partner, you don't just move on. The soul and the body are partners. And the soul stays with its body, very concerned about what's happening to its body. The soul wants its body to be treated properly. That's why, by the way, when the burial society is dealing with the body, preparing it, they ask forgiveness if by mistake they mismanaged it. If you're walking in a cemetery, the Jewish tradition is sometimes you have to step over a grave or something. You just don't have a choice. The Jewish tradition is, just say, sorry, forgive me. Right? No, the spirit will understand. But the point is the soul is there. The soul knows, and the soul wants burial. One last idea, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. I don't know where I got this from, but I have this monologue in my head where an older Jewish guy says to his kids, listen, kids, I don't claim to be the most religious Jew on the planet. Some things I do, some things I don't do. Looking back, maybe if I knew more, I'd do more. But there's one thing I do know. I was born a Jew. I'm proud to be a Jew. And when I die, I want to be buried as Jews have been buried for thousands of years. Because my last statement on planet Earth, I want it to be, here lies a proud Jew. To me, that speaks volumes. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. I hope I've addressed some of your main questions, but let's open it up for questions and comments. We can, I guess, rabbis, what do you just use the chat or open, or if you want to ask it, you just turn off your mute. I don't know how you want to do this.
Whoever can raise their hand, and we'll unmute them as it comes in.
Anybody want to start? Was there any questions, comments?
Amy Wachtel, I see.
Okay.
Unmute. There we go. I think everybody also has the option to unmute. So
Great.
here we go. Unmute.
Go ahead. You have to hit unmute, Amy.
Second, unmute. Why is not
mute? Okay,
Yeah,
can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you now.
Hi, everybody.
Wait,
I
what
put
happened?
it in the. Is it my turn?
all right?
No.
I put it in the chat. I hear somebody else. I'll mute until.
Okay. Can you hear me though?
Yes, go ahead, Amy.
Okay. So I want to thank you. This is very interesting and I appreciate it, and good evening to all. I want to say, okay, I 1,000% believe in a Jewish burial. Thank God I have a family plot that goes back to my great-grandparents. I mean, it's without a doubt. But I have to say, my observations are, like my aunt, for example, she was cremated, and yet she's buried, her urn or whatever they put your ashes in, her urn is buried in the ground, in the cemetery next to my uncle who's properly buried. So, you know, what the what? That's crazy. My partner, he says when he dies, he wants to be cremated. I feel as if this is just, it is so Jewish, but look at how many Jews don't eat kosher. Look at how many Jews didn't know it was Shavuos the other day. It's fallen into the category of things that are okay to dismiss, even though you consider yourself Jewish. And I don't really know what we can do to emphasize why it is precious. And it is about going back to the earth, and it is about honoring the body so the neshama is then properly greeted and elevated. And do you know what I'm saying? Like, I agree with you. It's such a major
Okay, so
Jewish
Amy,
thing.
thank you. You raised two excellent points.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Let me address both of them, okay? In the 1890s in England, there was a cremation fad. They had developed a new kind of oven that was more effective, and cremation started. It goes in waves, right? Burial's been around, cremation's been around, it goes in waves. And it started to take off in England, and Jews started to cremate in England, right, in the 1890s. And the rabbis in London made a decree forbidding the burial of cremated remains in Jewish cemeteries. They said you're not allowed to, right? Now, if you understand what cremation is, and if you understand Jewish law, that decree, that rabbinic decree from London in the 1890s is astonishing. Why? Well, because cremated remains are dirt. There's no DNA left. It is burnt to the degree that they are not recognizable from other cremated, burnt anything. I know forensics experts that don't even like cremation because there's no way they can do any research on the body if anything happens, right? Take a seed, put it in the ground, what do you get? A plant. Take a seed and burn it and put it in the ground, what do you get? You get an area of land that's not going to be farming. You can't farm it anymore. There's a soccer pitch in Scotland that doesn't allow people on the field because all these fans used to take their cremated remains of their loved ones and put them onto the soccer pitch because that was like the guy's religion, like he wanted to be buried with his favorite team, and it was destroying the grass. Okay, so the point is that so you can take dirt, you can take earth and put it into a cemetery. So why do these rabbis say you can't take cremated remains? There's no difference, right? A Cohen, you may have heard this, ladies and gents, a Cohen, descendant of Jewish priests, is supposed to avoid cemeteries, with certain exceptions, avoid death, right? So a Cohen can take an urn of cremated remains. They're nothing in Jewish law or in science. They're nothing. It doesn't mean anything. It's not the person. No DNA left. So why did these rabbis say don't put them in a Jewish cemetery? Well, their reasoning was fascinating. And it's proven itself, I think, historically, in my opinion. The reasoning was, if we start letting people bury cremated remains, in Jewish cemeteries, they're going to start thinking that cremation's not so bad. I can still do something Jewish. I can put a stamp of approval on it, right? And they wanted to send a signal out that it's not okay. By the way, some Jewish cemeteries today will let, and some won't let. Okay, if you happen to have the cremated remains of a loved one, again, we're not into guilt. What do you do with them? Okay, I know many people who they didn't know, and very often people get connected to Chabad later in their lives, and whatever. Who knows? They didn't know, and people are already grandparents, parents. Who knows, right? So, look, technically, what you can do with them in Jewish law, throw them in the garbage. But you're not going to do that because, this is your life. So, when nobody's looking, take it to the cemetery or take it to a park. Or it doesn't matter what you do, right? Treat it respectfully for your own psychology. It's not the person anyway. Right? But that's the problem with burying cremated remains. It gives the impression that cremation's okay. In terms of your second point, which I think was very well articulated, listen, I'm the guy. I feel it 10 times more than anybody else. I 100% agree. I do not think this is too late. On some subjects, it is really, really hard to talk about. I'll tell you, this subject, very few people are so committed to cremation that they're offended if you raise the subject. People come to my talks on cremation. I get nice crowds, all the time. Right? People are interested in this. So, get them a copy of my book. Tell them that you heard this lecture, right? And why don't they think about it? They'll make their own decisions. I'll respect you, whatever you decide. But at least, on Chabad.org, by the way, you can hear a short version of my talk. I have articles up there, other people's articles and talks. Share the message. That's the way that you get it out. You proactively talk about it, which is why I want to thank you, all four of you wonderful Chabad rabbis, for hosting this. And thank you all for coming, because it's not an easy topic, but the only way to deal with your second point is to proactively raise it as a community topic. And I think most people can be convinced. Okay, thank you. Mark, you've been waiting nicely.
Thank you. I thought that Jewish people don't get cremated because, for example, Christians believe you die, you get judged, you go to heaven or hell, you stay there forever. Jews believe in reincarnation sometimes, but they believe when the Messiah comes, the dead will rise and walk the earth again with everybody else. We'll have a big old party. Everybody will wake back up. And if you're cremated, or you've been an organ donor, or tonight I realize you've been embalmed, then that can't happen. Your body can't wake up, and death becomes permanent instead of temporary.
So
the
Mark,
other issue you said was
let me
about
deal with that one. Let me deal with that one first, okay? Because that's a big one, okay? And then you'll get to your other question. So Mark just raised an amazing question. By the way, Mark, you're in good company, because I am sure right now all four rabbis on the call are wondering about what you just asked. Meaning, the number one reason that our tradition talks about burial, the number one reason is the dead coming back to life. And this guy that we invited to speak from Israel didn't even mention it once. So they're like, what's going on over here, right? Which is what your question is. So I'll tell you, the reason that I don't mention it in the main talk is it always comes up in questions. Thank you very much. Never once has been missed. So you did your job, Mark. Thank you. Also, it freaks people out a little bit. You know what I think about, and I'm not proud of this, but now that we're friends, you know what I think about when I hear the phrase, the dead coming back to life? Intuitively, my first thought is Michael Jackson's Thriller video from 1980. Thriller. It looks foolish. The dead coming back to life. It seems like zombie movies, like Brazilian zombie movies. This is what we believe in. And so it takes a while to explain that, no, the dead coming back to life is a beautiful, holy idea at its core that we're introduced to through Hollywood or through different religions. So it seems weird and kind of foolish. We believe in that. And the idea is, no. We don't believe in their version of it. But if you get back to the core of where it comes from, and it goes like this. If you visited Israel, you probably went to Masada, the famous 2,000-year-old desert fortress that was destroyed by the Romans in 73 of the Common Era. Yigal Yadin, the archaeologist that is digging in the 1950s, finds 2,000-year-old date pits, extracts the DNA from those date pits. Right? We have date palm trees growing up the street in the Engedi Botanical Gardens. Voltaire once said, being born twice is no more of a miracle than being born once. It's an amazing idea. If you ever saw Jurassic Park movies where they recreate the dinosaurs, it's actually more science than science fiction, believe it or not. You know, there's Hollywood celebrities today that have cloned their pets when their pets die. Actual thing, they have cloned animals. Remember that sheep, that famous sheep, Dolly, that was in the news? The first sheep to be cloned? It's almost 30 years ago. Technology is astronomically advanced today. So the idea of the dead coming back to life, Judaism says that a person's body is never fully gone. The tradition describes it as a luz bone, L-U-Z in English. Some say it's up here, some say it's down there. Now, if you ask somebody, a forensics expert or, whatever, goes through like to find the bone, they won't be able to find the bone. It's so small. I believe that what Talmud is referring to is DNA. DNA never is destroyed unless you burn it, by the way. So that's why Judaism is against cremation. It's taking a step, you're denying, you're going against the whole process. Now, people point out, well, what about the victims of the Holocaust? They were murdered twice, so to speak. Once physically, and once their bodies were cremated against their will. They couldn't have proper Jewish burial. So it is very clear that when someone is cremated against their will, right, God is going to take care of them. It'll be okay. I also am convinced, and I've talked to great rabbis who agree, that if someone does it out of complete ignorance, you're born on a Pacific island, they never knew you were Jewish, cremation was the only thing you ever, okay, what do you blame, But we were supposed to, live from knowledge, not from ignorance. And we should try and spread the word so people know better. So yes, to answer your question, yes, that is a core part of Jewish belief, and it is a core part of this topic. I don't focus on it too much because I find it freaks people out a little bit. But then, that's my short explanation of where coming back to the body's coming back to life. Okay, now your second part, Mark, you had a second question?
You talked about I forgot the word, the nunneries and the convents and stuff. I went to Peru many years ago, and they have these huge, giant, beautiful churches. And you go inside, and in the basement of every one is a torture chamber. They got all the skulls in one bin, all the leg bones in another bin, everything's separate. And what they did was back in the Inquisition, they would go force the people to convert to Christianity. The Spaniards or whatever would go to, South America and force them to convert to Christianity. And it was my understanding the reason that the Jewish religion doesn't have anything like that is because we're not going to force people to be our religion. While the Christians, they would force people to convert, and they didn't care if you believed or not, but they wanted you to bring your kids to the church. And then your kids.
So how does this relate to burial and cremation? Yeah, I think you're right, but how does this relate to burial and cremation?
Well, you mentioned the monasteries and the force, and the Jewish people don't have the monasteries and the nuns and stuff like that. Right. So the religion is and the reason that the Jews don't have it is because we don't force people into our religion.
Right. I just don't think the monasteries and convents have to do with forcing people. In other words, the Inquisition was like that, but today there's thousands of monasteries and convents all over the world, and people choose them.
Okay.
So,
right.
But it's a great point. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Anything you want to share? Anyone else? Yes, Fran.
Okay. First of all, thank you for addressing with the Holocaust, because I am too. Gee, I really appreciate that. Made me feel better about my grandmother.
Of course.
In Florida, it's become so popular to have in the Jewish cemetery to be buried in a wall as opposed to in the ground.
Yeah.
And I don't understand it.
Okay, so I'll tell you something. First of all, rabbis, I hope it's okay. I'm not wearing a tie for this talk. when I used to travel around before COVID, I would always dress up for a lecture. But being at home has changed my whole attitude towards things. By the way, my wife was not happy when I told her I was going to Jamaica and the Caribbean, and then I kidded and I said, no, it's only on Zoom, don't worry. So if I ever come in person, God willing, we got to bring my wife, otherwise I won't be allowed. But we went through COVID. COVID is now in Israel is basically over. It's coming out of the restrictions very soon. But for a year, shuls were closed here. Literally for almost a year, there was like no regular shul. So we prayed upstairs in my parking lot, and I would wear a tie only on Friday nights to welcome Shabbat. And my kids would always bug me about my ties. By the way, Fran, I am answering your question, believe it or not. My kids would always bother me about my ties. I have 5 teenagers. 5 teenagers, guys. Give me some love. Come on, you know how it is. So my ties are too wide. My ties are too thin. My ties are too wide. My ties are too thin, right? And I say, I'm not getting rid of my ties, because I know in 5 years, they're going to be back. Like fads come, fads go, fads come, fads go. Like on ties, who cares? Fine, go with the fads. So you're right, Fran, it is a fad now. There's no question. Cost very often is the real reason behind people, but it's not really the money. It's that they don't see the reason to spend the extra money. It's even wealthy people. Wealthy people generally cremate at higher rates than poor people. So you can't tell me it's because of the money savings, but it's because they don't see the importance of it, and they just see that it's become normal. This was one of the great reasons. Do you remember the 2 years ago, Ilan Ramon's wife died? What was her first name? Anybody know? Ilan Ramon, the astronaut that was blown up in the space shuttle disaster, right? And the son died in an Air Force accident, right? Her husband and her son were blown up in space or air or whatever, and she died of cancer a couple of years ago. Rona, thank you very much, Rabbi. Rona Ramon, and she chose to be cremated. And the rabbis, the chief rabbis, and everybody in Israel, they tried so much to get the family to change her wishes, because you could understand psychologically why she chose cremation. Her husband and her son were blown up. There'd been enough pain, whatever. Okay, they can get on, but she was the first famous Israeli to choose cremation, and people were afraid, correctly so, that it's going to become a thing. Right? So what you're describing, Fran, correctly is that, yes, it has become a thing. I get it, okay? But whether it's mausoleums or it's cremation or whatever, but when you just take a step back and you say, okay, this isn't like what I'm having for lunch. This is like a big decision. This is not one of those decisions that you actually think about, you learn about, right? Go to a lecture, read a book. So one quick note on the above ground thing, just in particular. I notice that there are 2 seemingly contradictory attitudes towards death in the modern world. There's one attitude that says, I don't like it. I'm going to fight it, right? I'm going to slow it down. That's embalming. That's a metal casket. That's an above ground mausoleum in the wall, right? I'm going to do everything I can to deny it. The other says, I don't like it. I'm going to fight it. I'm going to speed it up. That's cremation. That's not 7 days of Shiva, it's 3 days, 1 day, quick memorial service, get it over with, right? Notice how they're opposite, one speed it up, one slow it down. But at the core, they're really the same. At the core, they're saying, I don't accept what's happening. And the Jewish view is, hey buddy, 6 days a week, you build the world, you improve the world. The 7th day, what do? You sit back and you say, I'm not in charge. Results are not up to me. Your whole life, our whole lives, we are building, improving the world. But at the end, I'm not going to try and speed it up. I'm not going to try and slow it down. I'm not going to do artificial. I'm just going to lay my body gently down to sleep and let nature take its course. It's the ultimate lesson in human humility. And human humility is not something that the modern world is very good at. So I think that's why you see all this kind of stuff, whether it's the mushroom suits, where there's somebody can get a TED talk. This lady created a mushroom suit which will help biodegrade the body faster. cost thousands and thousands of dollars, years of research. Put it underground, the body will biodegrade. What do you have to speed it up for? Mother Nature's been doing this for thousands of years. What are you worried about, right? Or put it into space or slow it down, just lay it gently down to sleep. That's the Jewish attitude. I think it's a very healthy attitude as well. Any other questions, comments, anything you want to share? Yes, Gordon.
Thank you, Doron. Very interesting. A question for you. When it comes to burial, does it matter if a Jewish person is buried in a Jewish cemetery or a non-denominational cemetery?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So thank you for the question. Two points. Number one, I don't know if you heard the story that I told about Rabbi Oshri from the Kovno ghetto, where the guy wants to be cremated rather than buried in a Nazi cemetery, and he responds that in normal times, we want to do everything right. That means the burial society, the Chevra Kadisha, preparation of the body. You know, when I was researching my book, I went to my first Tahara. Tahara literally means purification. Essentially, it's kind of like, going to mikveh, like a woman goes in a mikveh, after her menstruation cycle. The high priest on Yom Kippur, the holiest person on the planet, on the holiest day of the year, in the holiest place, the high temple would go to the mikveh 5 times, or for us 5 times. It's a connection to life, to the source of life, to water, right? So the body is put in a mikveh when possible, or water is poured on them, right, as part of the preparation. So all the other stuff is really important. A Jewish cemetery as well, by the way. By the way, if you're wondering why is it a Jewish cemetery versus multi-denominational, whatever? So it's interesting that religions throughout history have always disposed of their dead by faith. There are Catholic cemeteries and there are Protestant cemeteries. Try and get buried in a Muslim cemetery, guys. Good luck. They ain't gonna let you. Why is that? I mean, I can't speak for them, but why is that? Well, I think the reason is actually kind of beautiful. It's that we are not just an accidental community. We are a faith community. We are bonded to each other. By the way, if you just take a look at how people react to the 11-day war in Israel and how most of us react versus how some other people react, you see how we are bonded. Just to give you a quick, I don't want to get political, but my oldest son is an officer in Sahel in one of the combat units, okay? They estimate that less than 70 civilians were killed on the Palestinian side. Less than 70 civilians were killed. That is the best record statistically of any war in human history. We spent billions of dollars and risked my kid's life and many others to avoid, and instead of being applauded for it, look what's happening. We are bonded together. We have many friends amongst non-Jews. I do and you do. It's great. But the idea of being buried in a Jewish cemetery, just like I assume a Muslim or a Buddhist, whatever, it's that our bonds are eternal. They're not temporary. We live together. We live in the future together as well. That's the idea. So yes, whenever possible, absolutely in a Jewish cemetery. By the way, if there's no choice, right? The question in the Nazi example, of course, it's better to be buried anywhere than not buried. But I recommend to people, like the story I said at the end of the guy who says, listen, I'm not the best Jew in the world. I'm not the most religious Jew in the world, but when I die, I want to be buried as Jews have been buried for thousands of years. I want the rabbi to say the prayers. I want a little bit of dirt from the land of Israel. Do it right. I suggest, by the way, that don't leave it to chance. So many people, right? It's left till the end, and then the kids fight about it, and there's arguments about money and misinterpretations. This is your decision. Arrange everything. Pre-plan it. Have it very clear. When I go, I hope it's not for a long time. When I go, here's the Chabad rabbi's number. Here's his Instagram. Here's his email. Here's his address. Everything goes through him, right? I suggest you prepay it. Sometimes prepaying saves you money, and sometimes it actually costs you money. Who cares? Percentage-wise, it's an extra little nothing. It's extra few coffees. This way, it's not left to the end. I just went through very recently my father's burial. My father passed away recently. And it was a very beautiful thing Obviously tragic, but very beautiful. Why? Because there was no question where he was going to be buried, what was going to happen. There was no arguments about anything. It was time, the Shiva, a family comes together, right? We couldn't even do a proper Shiva because of COVID. Right? It was on Zoom. But still, it's like together, right? When things are not clear and they're not arranged, and there's grief, and you have 2 days and 1 day to make a decision, and there's fighting, and there's money involved, it leads to so much disturbance. Instead of religion and life cycle events bringing a family together, they tear a family apart. So I suggest you take care of everything before. I get no commission. It doesn't affect me at all. You pre-plan, you prepare, you make sure they know it's going to the Chabad rabbi. Everything is done. I want it done right. I want it done fully. These are my wishes, right? And you know, if my family members, you know, if you love and respect me, this is what you'll do for me, right? It's not about you, it's about me. So that's my answer to that. I hope that helps. Any other questions, comments, anybody? I don't want to keep you too long. I know it's getting late, especially in like, you're on 2 different time zones. So it's okay. So I'll leave you.
I have
Martin, one last.
Yeah, Martin Freifeld. Yeah, I just wondered if you could comment on perhaps people are tending more toward cremation than burial because the world is becoming so dispersed and so travel is so difficult for people. Kids are going everywhere around the world. It's so difficult to go back to a grave to honor their ancestors. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't know, Martin, did you hear when I talked about the issue at the beginning of Moses burial? I don't know if you heard that part. The idea was, you may want to listen to the recording. I don't want to go through the whole thing again, but I will say it like this. I will say it like this. Visiting a grave is not that important. I don't mean to insult anybody's memory. No one has ever visited Moses' grave, ever. That's what you'll hear on the recording. It's worth it just for that 5-minute period.
Sure.
Sorry, but that's fine. But he had a grave anyway. And I'll flip the script a little bit. Okay, let's say people choose cremation, right? So the first generation, how many urns do they have? 2, right? Next generation. Next generation. Next generation. You hear my point? I mean, like, our homes and our lives are not meant for the peaceful, for the long-term keeping of cremated remains. They're going to be discarded at some point anyways, usually pretty quickly, by the way. Every funeral home that I know of, there's been articles about this, has hundreds of unclaimed urns because people don't want them. Funeral home can't get rid of them because like they'll be sued, but they don't know what to do with them, right? So having the cremated remains doesn't solve mobility problems. It just puts them off for a generation. And the grave is important for all the reasons that we talked about anyway. And just, if you go to the video at that little 5-minute thing, it'll answer your question. Rabbis, any final words of wisdom or thoughts or anything?
Sorry, there's one.
I had my hand raised.
Jeff,
Sure.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I would just appreciate this very interesting conversation. And I noticed that in my research on the land use of cemeteries, there are over 2 million acres of cemeteries in the United States. And how it impacts the living is that a lot of the cemeteries are in urban areas and very sought after areas where people have a hard time finding a place to live while they're alive. So I wonder how you can address the issue of the impact, the land use impact on the living. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. Were you here at the very beginning of the talk, Jeff? Because
you caught me. I missed the beginning.
So the first 10 minutes of the talk, I addressed exactly that issue. I would encourage you to just go to the recording or go to Chabad.org and just, you hear me speak about landmass. By the way, when you hear the phrase 2 million acres, it sounds like a lot. Just so you know, the landmass of the United States is 10 million square kilometers. 2 million acres is nothing. Okay, the basic answer is that burial uses very little amount of land. We use more land for Walmarts every year than we do for burials. And by the way, that's speaking about nationally, right? And I'm only speaking to Jews, which are 2% of the population. But even if every person in America would be buried, there would be no problem of landmass. The only problem is if you want to be buried in downtown Manhattan. So who needs a cemetery in downtown Manhattan? You put them outside. How often do you go? Once a year, twice a year? That's the basic answer. But if you go back to the beginning of the recording, you'll hear much more. And what I did was somewhere on the chat, if you look, I put in a few resources for you, ladies and gents. Obviously, Chabad.org is the best Jewish resource online. It's got everything. On this subject, by the way, it has me speaking and a bunch of articles, and it has a lot of other, very impressive speakers, men and women on the subject and every other subject. There's also, if you want a quick reference, there's a website called peacefulreturn.org. I put the link there in the chat, and it has there, and by the way, it has in English, Russian, and Hebrew, top 10 list, short videos, all on this subject of burial and cremation. It's very, very fast and it's kind of quick. So if someone wants to get the top 10 facts in 5 minutes, that's a great way to do it. And of course, if you forgive the plug, to talk about it with other people, to get other people thinking about it. Cremation or Burial, my book on a subject. It's short and it's the point, and people seem to like it, if you don't mind my saying. So you can get it at mosaicpress.com or at amazon.com. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been a